Victorian London was a city of empire, but not for everyone. Behind the facades of large buildings, behind the shop windows and gas lamps, there were rooms that didn't even have space to sleep. One room, 10 bodies, one air. There was no silence here, even at night, because someone was always coughing, crying, or simply had nowhere to lie down. Diseases didn't come. They lived here, all the time. Hunger didn't scare. It was a habit. And the scariest thing wasn't that. The scariest thing was that the city knew, and it was passing by. This is not a story about poverty, and not about statistics. This is a story about life, which was compressed to the size of one dark room. And if you think that's just the past, listen to how many voices were not able to speak. London is imagined in different ways. A city of fog, a city of gaslights, a city of empire that never sets with the sun. But most have never looked where this city breathed the hardest. Not at the boulevards, not at the stations, not at the palaces, but at the rooms. Small, dark, with walls that saw more bodies than furniture. In Victorian London, there were rooms where space ended before life began. One room, 10 souls. And that's not a metaphor. It was an address. Here, people didn't wake up in the morning. Here, people just opened their eyes, if they were lucky. There was no silence here, even at night, because someone was coughing, someone was moaning, someone was rolling over, touching another because there was no room to move. The air was shared, damp, stagnant, and every breath reminded, you are not alone, even when you really want to be. Light hardly reached here. The windows, if there were any, looked not at the sky, but at the wall of another building. Day and night here only differed in temperature, cold in winter, suffocation in summer, and always cramped. These were not exceptions. These were not isolated cases. It was a system. Streets where the houses stood so close that not even the wind could pass between them. Entrances where the smell had no source because the source was everything. Stairs that were never clean because cleanliness made no sense where tomorrow everything would start again. And the scariest thing is not the horrors, not the screams, not the blood. The scariest thing is the habit. People got used to the cramped conditions, to the dirt, to the diseases. Children grew up not knowing that it was possible to live differently, that a room could be for 2 or for 1, that sleep was not a fight for a piece of the floor. Diseases did not come here. They waited. Tuberculosis, typhus, infections that spread not because they were evil, but because they were convenient. One room, 10 bodies, one air. And if one got sick, it was a matter of time. London knew about it. The authorities knew. The doctors knew. The newspapers wrote about it. But not on the front page. Because these rooms were not a scandal. They were a backdrop. The empire was building railways. It was opening exhibitions. It was talking about progress. And at the same time, millions were living in spaces that were not even meant for living. And the question was not whether it was cruel, but why it had become the norm. Because slums are not an accident. They are a consequence of rapid growth, indifference, the idea that someone can always live worse so that others can live better. And this story doesn't begin with reform. It begins with a room that isn't enough. Because if you understand this room, you can understand everything else. Why diseases became epidemics, why crime was a way to survive, why children grew up too early, and why the city refused to look inward for so long. In the next chapter, we'll leave this room and into the street, where there are hundreds of these rooms. And we'll see what life was like when privacy was a luxury and space was a privilege, and why this slum became a silent threat to the entire city. The street where space ends. If the room was a cage, then the street was a corridor between cages. To leave that dark room was not to be free. It was only to change the form of the cramped space. Victorian slums were not built, they grew. The houses were pressed together, as if seeking support. The floors were added in a hurry, without a plan, without light, without air. Between them remained passages that were called streets, but had nothing in common with what we call them today. There was no space for movement here, only for existence. The sun hardly reached here. Even in the daytime, the light looked tired, as if it didn't want to linger. The air stood still. It was not renewed, but accumulated. The smells didn't disappear. They layered. Food, moisture, human bodies, waste. All of this mixed, creating an environment where breathing became an effort. Children played here not because it was safe, but because there was no other place. They ran between puddles that never dried up, between stairs that led into darkness, between doors behind which someone was always sick. It was always loud here, crying, fighting, coughing. But at the same time, this street lived in constant silence, the silence where no one expects help, because help never came here. The city authorities knew about these places, but they looked at them from afar. On maps, these areas looked like spots, uneven, uncomfortable. It was easier to not see them, and that's why the slums grew denser. When a city grows faster than its conscience, it begins to shrink inward. People came to London in search of work. Factories promised money. The city was the future. But the future had no address. They were put where there was still room, in rooms that were already crowded. And each new person didn't break the system. They simply made it denser. Diseases spread here not because they were strong, but because they had nowhere to disappear. Water for washing was a rarity. Cleanliness was a luxury, and gradually the body began to accept it as the norm. The cough became a background. Fever is a common condition. Death is part of the rhythm. And the most dangerous thing was not that. The most dangerous thing was that these streets existed near the center of the empire. A few blocks from the theaters, banks, Parliament. Two worlds breathed different air, and one slowly poisoned the other. Because the slums are not a closed space. They are a source. Diseases do not stay where they started. They move, with people, with the air. And the city, which considered these streets alien, did not yet understand that they were part of it. In the next chapter, we will see how this closeness turned into a threat that could no longer be ignored, and how the slums went from being a domestic problem to becoming a matter of survival for all of London. When disease became a neighbor. At first, it was just a cough, isolated, out of sync. like a random sound in the general noise of the street. No one stopped. No one counted. A cough in the slums did not mean disease. It meant life, because the person coughing was still breathing. But over time, the sound began to repeat, from one house to another, from one room to 10 others. And people noticed that the cough was no longer personal. It became collective. In the Victorian slums, diseases did not come suddenly. They crept, slowly, imperceptibly, step by step. Tuberculosis, typhoid, dysentery. The names sounded scientific, but in reality, they were just bodies that were weakening. Fever was not scary. It was tolerated. A temperature is not a reason to not go to work. Pain is not a reason to take up space in a room. There is no room for illness in a cramped space. There is only time, and it always works against the weaker. A person could lie on the floor while others stepped over them, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, because if they stopped, everything would stop, and then there would be no food, no work, no choice. The children were the first to get sick, not because they were weaker, but because they breathed lower. Their faces were where the air was heaviest. Their lungs were used to the humidity, to dust, to bacteria that had nowhere to go. The death of a child didn't cause a scream. It caused silence. The same silence in which adults tried to understand how to live on when yet another soul disappeared from a crowded room. Doctors knew about these places, but rarely went there. Not out of fear, out of powerlessness. Medicine at that time knew how to name symptoms, but could not change the conditions. And the conditions were the main cause. The slums were an ideal environment, not for people, but for diseases. It was warm here, damp, cramped, and each new inhabitant became a new opportunity for spread. The city had not yet panicked, because diseases seemed local. They lived there, not here. In central London, people closed their doors and believed that distance was protection. But distance didn't stop the air. It didn't stop the water. It didn't stop people. Servants were returning home. Workers were going to the factories. Children were running between districts. And with them, diseases moved. Slowly, silently. The city was starting to cough. And this cough could be heard not only in the slums. Newspapers began to write cautiously, without panic, without headlines. Outbreaks, cases, concerns. But the words weren't scary yet. The scary thing was the feeling that something was getting out of control. People were starting to fear not the darkness, but their neighbors. Not the streets, but the breath of someone else. And it was at this moment that the city found itself on the edge of awareness. Because disease is not just about the body, it is about fear. And fear has the ability to spread faster than any infection. In the next chapter, we will see how this fear spread beyond the slums, how the disease ceased to be foreign, and how the city first felt a threat within itself. When fear went beyond the slums. Fear doesn't appear immediately. It grows. First as a feeling that is impossible to name, then as a thought that you try to push away, and only later does it become obvious. In London, it didn't happen in the slums. Fear was a permanent resident. It was not noticed because it never went. It came outside when the diseases ceased to have an address. When the first cases appeared where they were not expected, in houses with doors, in flats with windows, in neighborhoods where people believed that space was a protection. That time the city froze, not from a shout, from a realization. People started to look at each other. Coughing in the streets would draw at the people. A sneeze is a retreat. A neighbor who seemed familiar yesterday became a risk today. The markets were empty. Some shops closed earlier, not because of an order, out of fear, because there were no orders yet. The authorities spoke cautiously, without harsh words, without admitting failure. The situation is under control. There is no reason to panic. These phrases were repeated like a prayer. But the city was no longer listening to words. It was listening to symptoms. The hospitals were filling up. Not suddenly, gradually. Beds were being occupied. The corridors were filled with quiet voices. The doctors worked non-stop, but they understood. They were not fighting the cause. They were fighting the consequences. Because the cause was everywhere, in the air, in the water, in the crowd. And the more the city tried not to look in that direction, the stronger the threat became. Funerals became shorter, without unnecessary words, without long pauses. Death lost its solemnity. It became commonplace. And it was then that London felt shame for the first time. Not for the poverty, not for the slums, but for allowing them to exist for so long. The newspapers began to change their tone. Concern appeared between the lines. Questions that had not been asked before were now being raised aloud. Is the city safe? Can the water be trusted? Does space protect? And the answers became fewer and fewer. Because fear has the ability to destroy simple explanations. People began to look for the guilty, some in the slums, others in the government. But the truth was more complicated. This was not the fault of one person. This was the result of years of procrastination. And the city was faced with a choice: to continue to pretend that the problem was there, or to admit that it was here, in every breath, in every step, in every street. In the next chapter, we will see how fear turned into pressure, how silence became impossible, and how the city, which had been postponing a decision for so long, began to prepare for change for the first time. When silence became an accomplice. Silence is also an action. In Victorian London, silence had long been a form of consent, not evil, not intentional, simply convenient. When the slums suffocated, they kept quiet because it was believed to be their fate. When diseases crawled through the streets, they kept quiet because they believed they would stop on their own. When fear reached the centers, silence began to weigh more than words, because now it meant a refusal of responsibility. The city authorities met more frequently, not for loud declarations, for careful formulations. Papers were moved from one table to another, commissions were created, reports were written, but between the lines one thing was read. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge the scale of the problem. Because to acknowledge means to act, and to act means to spend money, break the usual order, admit mistakes. And the scariest thing is to say out loud that the city was built incorrectly. Doctors sounded the alarm. Not all of them, not right away, But those who saw the hospitals from the inside knew this was not another outbreak. This was a symptom. They talked about the air, about the water, about the crowding, about how treating people in such conditions is like trying to drain a river with a spoon. They listened to them, nodded, and postponed. Because real solutions were scary. To demolish neighborhoods, to relocate thousands, to build something that the city had never known before. And all this without a guarantee of quick results. And London liked quick solutions, but diseases did not obey schedules. The number of cases grew, slowly, inexorably. Fear was no longer chaotic, it became organized. People changed their routes, they avoided certain areas. They began to distinguish between safe and dangerous streets. But the map of fear did not match the map of the city, because the threat did not stay in one place. The water flowed, the air moved. People moved from one area to another, and silence turned into lies. Not the kind that they told deliberately, but the kind they repeated so they wouldn't hear their own conscience. During this period, the first voices emerged that spoke not about symptoms, but about the root, about living conditions, about housing, about overpopulation. They did not speak loudly. They were not printed in capital letters, but they were persistent. They said that slums were not a social problem, they were a biological threat. That diseases did not recognize borders. That the city was a single organism, and if one part of it rotted, the rest could not remain healthy. These ideas were irritating, because they demanded not to patch, but to rebuild. Not to treat the consequences, but to change the environment. And it was here that the silence began to crack, because now it threatened not only the slums, it threatened the city's reputation, its economy, its future. The empire could not afford to appear weak in its own heart. The question was no longer, is there a problem? The question was, is London ready to admit that its way of life was a threat to itself? This was the moment when silence first became more dangerous than words. And in the next chapter, we will see how fear and shame turned into the first real steps. Not quick, not easy, but inevitable. When a city dared to tackle a problem. The first steps always seem small, especially when the problem seems so big. London didn't wake up one morning with a rescue plan in place. It woke up with the realization that it could no longer do nothing. The solutions came not as orders, but as attempts. Limited, cautious, almost shy. First, inspections. People with papers and notebooks started to go for the first time where they had never looked before. Into the slums, into the rooms, into the yards where the earth never dried. They counted, measured, recorded. How many people were in the room? How many beds? How many windows? How much air, if it could be counted at all? The numbers were more frightening than any rumors. But numbers don't scream. They are easy to hide in reports. And the city tried to do just that. Because each number meant a question, what to do with it? The first proposals were cautious, to ventilate, to wash the streets, to limit the number of residents in the premises. On paper, it looked logical. In reality, it was almost impossible. Where should people go? Who would be told, you can't live here anymore? Who would pay for new housing? Who would build it quickly? Who would take responsibility for the consequences? Each decision rested with another, and so the city stopped again. But this time, the stop was different. It was accompanied by a sense of time running out. Because diseases did not wait for discussions to end. They kept on moving. And now it was visible on the maps. Cases were marked with dots. Dots were connected by lines. Lines went beyond the slums. And at that moment, even the most cautious understood. This was not a local crisis. This was a city crisis. The first attempts at control appeared. Some houses were deemed unfit. They were closed. They were not demolished. They simply locked the doors. People were temporarily relocated, wherever they could, however they could. It was not a solution. It was a postponement. But even that provoked resistance. Homeowners protested. They were losing their income. Residents were afraid. Temporary housing was often no better. The city teetered between two fears, the fear of doing nothing and the fear of doing it wrong. And it was here that the problem took on a new form. It was no longer just medical or social. It became political, because every step now had consequences. Every decision had enemies, and every delay increased the price. In this tension, a new understanding was born. Slums are not just places where the poor live. They are a symptom of the way the city manages space, power, and life. And unless the system changes, no temporary measures will save. When reform met fear. Reforms never begin with consensus. They begin with resistance. When London first seriously began to talk about slum redevelopment, the city shuddered. Not with hope, with fear. Because change meant the loss of the familiar, even if that familiarity was painful. Homeowners saw the reforms as a threat to their profits. They talked about property rights, about the economy, about the impossibility of quick fixes. And there was logic in their words. Demolishing a house is not just about freeing up space. It is about destroying someone's income system, someone's stability, even if that stability was built on cramped and dirty. The slum dwellers were no less afraid. For them, reforms did not mean salvation. They meant the unknown. Where to go? What to live for? Who will take care of tomorrow? People who had lived in cramped conditions for years had become accustomed to the idea that this was theirs. And now someone would come and say, "This is dangerous. This must be changed." But they didn't always say what would happen next. And in this uncertainty, resistance was born. Newspapers were divided. Some wrote about humanity, about the need for change, about the city's responsibility. Others wrote about expenses, about chaos, about the dangers of social experiments. Public opinion was not unified. It swung like a pendulum, and each new case of illness pushed it in the other direction. The city tried to find a compromise. Instead of mass demolition, selective projects. Instead of relocating thousands, experiments with individual neighborhoods. It seemed sensible, careful. But the problem was not caution. The problem was scale. The slums were not a stain. They were a fabric. They permeated the city so deeply that to tear them out in part was to leave an infection. And fear began to change shape. Now it was not just a fear of disease, but a fear of change, a fear of losing control, a fear of upsetting a balance that, while bad, was familiar. And at that moment, the reform stopped for the first time. Not for lack of ideas, for too much fear. The city stood at a crossroads. On the one hand, the realization that the old order was killing. On the other, the fear that the new order would destroy more than it saved. And it was at this point that history usually either broke or moved to a new level. London did not yet know what choice to make, but time was no longer on its side, because diseases did not wait for solutions. They continued to remind of themselves, and the longer the dispute lasted, the more obvious it became. Half-baked solutions would not work. When solutions become irreversible. Sometimes a city reaches a point of no return. Not because the solution is perfect, but because inaction has become more dangerous than any risk. In London, this moment was not accompanied by applause or solemn declarations. It came quietly, through a signature, through a seal, through a document that changed everything, without changing anything on the surface. Reform was announced, not as a promise, as a necessity. Slums, for years considered an inconvenient backdrop, now became an official problem. And that wording carried weight, because a problem is something that needs to be solved. It wasn't the houses that disappeared first. The illusion was gone. The inspections were no longer symbolic. They were given authority. Some neighborhoods were deemed unlivable. Not bad, not undesirable, dangerous. That word changed everything, because now it was impossible to ignore. People began to be relocated. Not all of them, not immediately, not ideally. But for the first time, there was movement. It was slow, painful. Families were leaving places where generations had lived, even if those places were cramped and dark. Because habit is also the shape of a house. The houses began to be demolished, not dramatically, without spectacle, just dismantled, brick by brick. And behind each wall, a story of life that had been lived in such close quarters for so long that it had become invisible was revealed. The city watched these processes with anxiety, because each destroyed building was a reminder. This is how people lived, and we allowed it. Resistance did not disappear. It became quieter but deeper. Some people lost their income. Some people lost their familiar streets. Some people lost their sense of control. And at the same time, something new was emerging. Discussions about space, light, air. What had previously been considered a luxury now became a criterion for safety. For the first time, the city began to think not in terms of the number of inhabitants, but in terms of the quality of conditions. It was revolutionary and dangerous, because every revolution destroys more than it builds, at least at first. Diseases didn't disappear overnight. The slums didn't disappear overnight. But there was a sense that the direction had changed, and that sense was stronger than statistics, because it meant that the city was finally learning from its mistakes. The price was high: money, time, social tension. But the alternative was even more expensive. To continue living as before meant accepting disease as the norm. And for the first time, London said no. Not perfectly, not immediately, but loudly. What remains after change? Change rarely brings immediate relief. More often, they bring silence. Not calm, not soothing, but the kind of silence in which people try to understand what exactly has just happened. London, after the reforms, looked different. Not new, not cleaned up, but bare. The places where houses had stood suddenly turned into voids. The streets seemed wider, brighter, but at the same time strangely unwelcoming, for the space that had once been filled with life was now silent. And in that silence there were more questions than answers. People returned to the same areas and did not recognize them, not because of beauty, because of absence. The house was no longer there. The stairs, too. The windows through which the sun never peeped did not exist. And with them, part of the memory disappeared. Not official, but personal. The memory of where a bed stood, where someone was sick, where someone died, where someone was born in a cramped space that no one would ever see again. The reforms did not erase the past. They only hid it underground. And this created new tension, because now the city could pretend that the slums did not exist, that they were just a stage. But those who lived there knew the slums do not disappear unless the conditions that created them disappear. Many were resettled, yes, but new housing did not always mean a new life. Some families found themselves further from work, some in even greater poverty. The crowding eased, but the instability remained. And the city once again teetered between pride and shame. Pride for daring to act, shame for acting so late. Diseases gradually receded. They did not disappear, but they lost their mass. This was seen as proof of success, and at the same time as a reminder, because if the conditions had created disease once, they could create it again. The city began to see itself differently. There was talk of ventilation, light, building density. What had not been discussed before was now a subject of debate. But along with this, a new threat appeared: forgetfulness. Because people quickly get used to improvements, and even faster, to the idea that the problems were solved forever. New generations grew up without the slums that their parents had seen. For them, it was history, not experience. And this is where the danger lay. Because history that is not felt by the body easily becomes abstraction. And abstractions are not scary. London changed, but it did not become ideal. It became more cautious. And this caution was its new form of strength. Because a city that has survived its own mistake begins to ask other questions. Not how to build faster, but for whom. Not how much will fit in, but can you live here? But these questions had to be repeated constantly, because they are not fixed once and for all. The mirror into which the city looked for the first time. After changes, there always comes a moment when you can no longer only deal with actions. It is time to look, not forward, back, and inward. After the reforms, London began to see itself differently, not as a city of success, not as the capital of an empire, but as an organism that once almost suffocated within its own walls. New lines appeared on maps. New words appeared in documents. But the real changes were not taking place there. They took place in the idea of the city. Now streets were evaluated not only by their capacity, but by whether their light got here. Houses not only by their number of rooms, but by how much air they could fit between the walls. For the first time, the city began to count not just people, but also the conditions of their lives. It was a slow process, without loud victories, because awareness always comes later than action. And with it comes the awkward question: why didn't we do it sooner? The answer was not simple, because the problem was not a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of desire to see. The slums were known. The diseases were documented. But while the threat remained local, the city could afford to ignore it. And it was this awareness that was the most painful, because it removed the last excuse. London understood that indifference could be systemic, and that it had consequences. During this period, new professions emerged, new roles: city planners, sanitary inspectors, people who were responsible not for buildings but for the environment. This was a new way of thinking. The city was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a space in which someone had to live, and that living finally mattered. But with it came another fear, the fear of repetition. Because if the city had allowed this level of crowding once, it could allow it again. The growth did not stop. The empire continued to expand. People continued to come. And each new generation faced the same choice: to grow faster, for responsibility, or with it. The mirror into which London looked did not give easy answers. It only showed the consequences of decisions. And the city began to understand. Real reforms don't end after construction. They end only when they cease to be necessary. And that means never. When silence became dangerous again. After great changes, silence always comes. Not the kind of silence that scares, but the kind that calms. London entered it cautiously, as if into a room where you don't yet know whether you can relax. The slums were disappearing from the map. Reforms were moving from the category of news to the category of history. People were starting to move on with their lives again. And it was at this moment that the city risked making the oldest mistake of all, deciding that the lesson had been learned forever. Silence has a strange property. It erases memory. Not immediately, gradually. What seemed unacceptable yesterday seems like an exaggeration today, and tomorrow, like an ancient legend. New neighborhoods were built with light and air in mind, or so they said. But the city grew faster than the promises. The demand for housing again exceeded the possibilities, and the compromises were back. A little denser, a little cheaper, a little less space. No one called it a return to the slums. These were temporary solutions, transitional stages, the challenges of growth. The words changed. The essence was no. And once again, houses appeared where the number of residents exceeded the capacity of the walls. Once again, ventilation became a formality. Light was an advantage, not a standard. But now it looked different, cleaner, newer, less obvious. That is precisely why it was more dangerous. Because new problems didn't shout, they whispered. Doctors began to notice repeated symptoms. Not massive, isolated, but familiar. Cough, chronic fatigue, children who get sick often. It didn't look like a catastrophe, and so it was easy to ignore. Politicians talked about the successes of the past, about how London overcame the crisis, about an example for other cities. And there was truth in these words, but not all of it. Because real success is not in solving the problem, but in not letting it return. And here the city was once again faced with a choice. Not as loud as before, but much more difficult. Should we continue to invest in prevention when the threat is not obvious? Or should we wait until it becomes tangible again? Silence is tempting. It allows us to postpone. It gives us the illusion of control. And that is why it is dangerous. Because slums never start as slums. They start as compromises, as a stopgap solution, as saving space, as just a little bit more density. And if we don't stop it, history repeats itself. Not literally, not in the same form, but with the same result. London began to understand this, slowly, without panic, but with a new fear, the fear of repetition. And this fear was more mature than the previous one, because now the city knew how it could all end. When a city learned to listen. Cities don't have memories like people do. They don't remember events. They retain consequences. London was no longer the same slum. There were no more rooms where 10 souls shared one air. In their place, other buildings appeared, other streets, other routes, and from the outside, it looked like a finished story. But cities rarely finish stories. They only change their shape. London learned to listen not immediately. First, the body. Coughs, fatigue, diseases which appeared where there was not enough space. Then, space. Light, which did not reach the windows. Air, which did not move between the walls. And only then, people. Those who lived in cramped quarters, who were accustomed to scarcity, who had no voice until the city began to suffocate with them. The real lesson of the slums was not in architecture and not in reform. It was in a simple sense. If you don't hear the faintest signals, the city will be forced to hear the loudest ones. London learned to look under your feet, under the streets, under its own decisions. It understood that growth is not just numbers, it is responsibility, and that every compromise leaves a mark, not always noticeable, not immediately, but always accumulative. Cities, like people, rarely break instantly. They break slowly, by habit, by silence, by procrastination. And that is why the stories of the slums are important not as horror, but as a warning. Because they show that disasters do not begin with explosions. They begin with small decisions that seem temporary, with rooms that are a bit cramped, with houses that are tolerable, with the idea that this will not last. London survived this, not without loss, not without shame, but it learned a lesson. And this lesson does not live in museums. It lives in rules, in norms, in demands for light, air, and space, in the desire to prevent a repeat. But memory is a fragile thing. It must be maintained, reminded, rethought. Because as soon as silence seems too comfortable, the city risks stopping listening again. And that is exactly why we tell these stories. Not to scare, but to remember. If you like this slow, calm look at the complex pages of history, if you value the silence between words and stories that stay with you for a long time, subscribe to the channel. Here we listen to the past not for noise, but for understanding. You can also leave a comment. Sometimes the most important thoughts are born after the story is over. Thank you for being here, and good night.